Welcome to Take a Seat, where we sit down with experts on a wide range of topics related to the science of human flourishing. Together, we're going to explore topics that can help us level up, give us hope, and maybe even make us feel optimistic about the future and our ability to live good lives both individually and collectively. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Holton. I'm a coach, consultant, and speaker in the field of optimal human functioning, but I'm most passionate about science and stories that can help us create a better system of education, one that leads individuals to the greatest angels of their nature and builds stronger societies as a result. Together with the Shipley School, a global leader in educating for flourishing, we're happy to have you join us. Whether you're someone trying to build your best self or a better community, we've got something for you, so take a seat. Welcome back in, everyone. I'm so pumped to share this conversation with you today. This time around, we took a seat with Steven Kotler. He's the executive director of the Flow Research Collective and happens to more or less be a boss of mine as well. Steven is a former journalist. He has multiple New York Times bestselling books to his name, including his most recent book, just out in January, called The Art of the Impossible, which he was quick to remind us is actually swept about every bestseller list out there. Steven is an expert in flow, the biological state in which we generate some incredible neurochemistry, lose our sense of self and inner critic, experience the dilation of time, and become completely absorbed in what we are doing. Flow is a state we are evolutionarily designed really to get into, and so it's not coincidental that in this state we tend to both feel our best and perform at our very best. Steven's work with the Flow Research Collective involves reverse engineering this state, trying to boil it down to a set of heuristics that can really help more individuals, teams, organizations experience greater flow in their lives. And doing so is really a key to what Kotler calls achieving different forms of the impossible. In our conversation, we dove into exactly what flow is, a bit about how to get into it, and a whole lot more about its place in schools and learning environments in general. It was a really inspiring and thought-provoking back and forth. It really left us with a feeling that we know a lot more than we once did about peak performance, its role in mental health and the good life, and most importantly, how we can start getting more of it in our lives and in our schools today. So here it is, a really exciting conversation with best-selling author and award-winning speaker, Steven Kotler. So I'm interested in topics like these. I'm in Los Angeles, I'm hiking up Fryman Canyon, and I'm listening to a podcast called The Science of Success. And I happened to stumble upon your episode. This was years ago, right? And here you are. This is the first time I had been introduced to you. And you're talking about flow, which was a part of my dissertation, in a way that was far less, I love the phrase you use, far less hand-wavy than I had seen it up till that point, right? I was deeply into like Csikszentmihalyi's work and those sort of things. And here you are talking about the neurochemistry of it. And I'm sitting here listening to this and I'm just thinking, man, this is the direction things are going to go. We've got this sort of constantly evolving and more refined level of scientific rigor around these experiences that really can actualize human potential. And so, of course, where does my head go? Like, man, how do we get this into classrooms? How do we get more and more people in these huge systems that are really, I think, meant to be cultivating human potential, right? Having these sort of experiences. Now, you can make arguments about whether or not that's really like why education was designed. And certainly the cynical view is it was not designed for that. I understand that, but that's where I would like to see it go. So ultimately, I'd love to kind of go down that road with you, have our audience learn a little bit more about flow as a state, talk a little bit about how we're getting closer to maybe sets of heuristics, and dig into, your new New York Times bestseller, Art of Impossible. So we'll kind of bounce around to those sort of topics, if that sounds good to you.
I think the more time we can spend on the fact that, like, I swept the bestseller lists, Maybe we could say that like every 3 minutes or 4 minutes, you could be like, by the way, that I haven't mentioned this new book swept the bestseller list.
Give me the sweep. What's the full?
God,
I mean, I know LA Times, I know New York Times, but
New York Times, LA Times, USA Today, Publishers Weekly, Chicago Tribune, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Washington Post, Amazon, Southern California Independent Booksellers, which is the biggest indie, and
okay, cool.
And which I love. That was actually my favorite. Because it means people are going to independent bookstores and buying my book, which is super rad as far as I'm concerned. Like, I was really happy about that. There's one other, but as far as we can tell, and there is, I don't know if you know this. Hold on, let me see if I can get it.
Okay.
I don't know the last time we talked.
You and I haven't chatted since my interview, which just so we're clear and being fair here, like everybody should know that I work for you.
By the way, are you seeing what this is?
Yes, I am. Yep. I'll read it off. Applications of flow in human development and education, which is something I plan to pick up.
I mean, like, this came out in between here. This is all of Mike's work on education. It's all the flow work on education. Of course, I haven't read it.
Right.
Yet. This is on my to-read shelf. There's there's really cool findings on grit, and there's really cool findings on when teachers are in flow and when students are in flow. And they're not what you would think.
Tell us what flow is.
Flow is an optimal state of performance. It's an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. Scientific definition. That doesn't get us very far. More colloquially, it is any of those moments of rapt attention, total absorption. We get so focused on the task at hand, everything else seems to disappear. So action awareness are going to start to merge. Your sense of self and self-consciousness and even awareness of bodily process is going to diminish. Time is going to pass strangely. Usually it speeds up. 5 hours go by in 5 minutes. Occasionally we get a freeze frame. In fact, it slows down. Anybody who's been in a car crash is familiar with that. And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, tend to skyrocket. That's more colloquially. When psychologists define flow, they take all the things I just said and they break them apart into 6 core characteristics: complete concentration on the task at hand, the merger of action awareness, the diminishment of self, time dilation, and so forth. And they measure it. How much or how little did this thing show up during a given experience? If all 6 of those characters, all 6 of flow's core psychological characteristics show up in experience, they call it flow, and you can measure it that way. The work I do, which is one level down, is on a neurobiological and neurophysiological level. And we now know there are a bunch of very clear neurobiological markers that mean flow. And it's gotten all the way down to like physiology. And this isn't totally locked down, like you can take it to the bank, but there's a preponderance of studies that are starting to show that flow even has a facial signature showing up in our microexpressions. What some of the early studies have shown, and there's a little bit of conflicting data, so it's open still, but this is kind of cool. Turns out your frown muscles are paralyzed or less active in flow. Smile muscles are hyperactive. Now, important also, just because you're a scientist, when your frown muscles are paralyzed or downregulated, it doesn't mean you can't be unhappy. That is true about flow. Yeah. Frowning is actually a signal that you're doing work. So that lack of a frown is actually a signal of the effortless attention, bottom-up effortless attention that seems to underpin flow. A lot of people have contributed to this, but it is really cool because it opens up some really neat research possibilities down the road.
Cool. So you mentioned our work. Let's go that route for a second. Why don't you tell us a little bit about, your organization, the Flow Research Collective, and what it is that the collective does?
For sure. We're a research training organization. On the research side, we study the neurobiology of peak performance, which means we specifically study what is going on in the brain and the nervous system when people are performing at their best. Flow is at the center of our work, but so is motivation and grit and learning and creativity and all those other aspects. And we use what we learn from the science. We do this, by the way, on the science side. We do a lot of our own work, but we work in conjunction with scientists and neuroscientists at the University of Miami, at USC, at UCLA, at Imperial College London, and a couple other places. And then we have some partnerships with industry. For example, Deloitte Consulting. We have been doing an ongoing flow and business success study with Deloitte Consulting for a number of years. I still don't think we know anything data-wise, but it's ongoing. And then we take the science, we take what we learn, and we use it to conduct our trainings. We do mostly digital trainings these days. People, if they're 8-week trainings, as a general rule, to get people in, you go through them with a PhD psychologist or neuroscientist, such as yourself, as a coach, and we train about 1,000 people a month are moving through our programs, and it's everybody from the crazy elite side, members of the U.S. Special Forces, professional athletes, to C-suite executives at all the major Fortune 500 companies, and then all the way through soccer moms from Indiana and insurance brokers from Iowa. It's a broad spectrum of folks, and the good news about that is, because we're all data geeks at this particular company, we measure everything. So we have huge data sets on the back end on peak performance, right? Over the course of my career, the people have estimated I've trained somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 people. Like, it's a lot of people, right? So there's a lot of, not that we have data capture and all that, but it's a big data set on peak human performance in broad swatches of the population. And we learn things that way too.
Yeah, just to kind of reinforce what you meant about the broad range of people that come through FRC. I mean, just this weekend alone, professional athlete, augmented reality at Facebook and Google separately, and then somebody who wants to get in the Cowgirl Hall of Fame, right? Like, I mean, it's
wow, that's awesome.
These people are so interesting. Cool. Yeah.
A lot of my work is focused on what does it take to do the impossible, but to understand that you have to get past the hyperbole and understand, I mean it at a practical level. So as a general, when it comes to the Flow Research Collective, the collective has been designed to be, and I think it now is, the very best in the world. Our clientele knows this and comes, you know what I mean? Like, I always say Scott Barry Kaufman, who's one of the world's leading experts on creativity.
And the first episode of this series, by the way.
The first episode of the series, is one of our coaches, right? Chris Bertram, when he's not working with our clients, is coaching the Canadian Olympic snowboard team. And, Mark McMorris, who just won natural selection, which may be the coolest snowboard event in the history of the universe. So, it's a collection of badass people who are working with a collection of badass people. Though we're open to everybody. We don't care who you are. You just, got to bring it.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're interested really in kind of being the best version of yourself, at least from the performance angle, right? This seems to be the people that FRC attracts. So let's talk about SBK for a minute. So, I'm running a little book club for an acting group in Los Angeles around your new book, The Art of Impossible. And we separated it into 4 chunks based on the book's 4 chunks. So part 1 is motivation, part 2 is learning, part 3 is creativity, and part 4 is flow. So this past weekend was creativity. So of course, what I do, reach out to Scott Barry Kaufman and say, hey, you want to come hang with us and chat with us? And that was awesome. He did a great job. But the reason I bring him up is you were recently on his podcast, the Psychology Podcast, which is the #1 psychology podcast in the world. And I love listening to the conversation, and something you've mentioned once or twice in other episodes I've heard you on, but it really stuck out to me this time around, which is this connection that you're drawing between quote unquote not going big and mental health, depression specifically, right? So for context, right, I work at the Shipley School. That's who's running this podcast. We're in Philadelphia, up the street from UPenn. For years, they've kind of been moving forward with positive psychology and positive education and flourishing in general, which is really what this series is trying to get at. And I think one thing you always deal with in schools is when you talk about wellness or well-being or positive psychology, you hear happiness, you hear joy, right? And sometimes the performance side can get set aside. Then you also have these people who are like, but we're a school. We need to be performance oriented. And what I think I hear you saying sometimes, and certainly this was the case in the conversation with SBK, is sometimes the mental health side is really tied in to whether or not you're going big, tied in to whether or not you're really trying to perform at your peak level.
So, yes. And let's pull back, giving you big picture first, a couple things that are worth talking about here. So before we get into the specifics, the way you want to think about it is peak performance is nothing more or less than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. And what the research has started to show more and more and more now, I think, as I write in Art Impossible, it's sort of overwhelming, that biology is a system. The system is designed by evolution to come online in a certain order and to work in a certain way. This is not to say that you can't perform at your best by doing it differently or your own order, like that's not true at all. But seems like when you get everything pointing in the same direction and working the way it was designed to work, you go farther faster with, pardon the alliteration, but far less fuss. Right? That seems to be the case. And when I say like your biology, it's a system, it's designed to work in a certain order. It's sort of like a vacuum cleaner is a system. It's designed to work in a certain way. And it's designed to do a certain job, like inhale dust. And if you want to use the vacuum cleaner as a hammer, it may be a spectacular hammer, but it may break, right? Like you can use it other ways, but like the system was designed to work a certain way. And there's probably going to be, right, difficulties. One of the things that you start to learn about peak performance is we're working from, I like to say from zero to dangerous, but we're really like going from zero up to like Superman. Most of psychology is about subpar back to zero, right? That's what most of psychology does. Two things are very obvious. One, there are, in the case of significant trauma, exceptions. But there, as a general rule, the same tools that take you from subpar to zero also help you go from zero to Superman, Superwoman, right? Like they're the same tools. Why? Because it's the same biology, because it's the same sequence. So for me to answer the thing you brought up, we have to talk about where that sequence starts. Sequence tends to start with motivation. And what the psychology shows is extrinsic motivation comes first, right? The first thing you have to do is take care of basic safety and security needs. And that means money, the shit in the external world, stuff that is outside yourself. You don't need a lot of it, but you have to be able to take care of your basic safety and security needs with a little left over for discretionary fun. And because otherwise there's too much anxiety in the system. Right. You just can't perform at your best. It's too big of a block. You're never going to be able to do it for a lot of reasons we can go into, but whatever. Once that is solved, there are 5 major intrinsic motivators that are next in line. And they're designed evolutionarily, again, the sequence it appears, to go from curiosity, which is designed to be built into passion, which seems to build into purpose. At once an organism has their purpose, it needs freedom, autonomy, the autonomy to pursue that purpose. And once you have that autonomy to pursue the purpose, you need mastery, the skills to pursue that purpose. And by the way, all of those subcategories that I just talked about, curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, and mastery, they do double duties. They're foundational intrinsic motivators, are apparently our biggest 5 intrinsic motivators. They're also flow triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. They all drive focus into the present moment. That's why they drive flow. But so if you get all of these things online and pointed in the same direction, you not only get all that intrinsic motivator power, you start to get flow. Now, from a peak performance standpoint, let's talk about why this matters before we go to what you raised, just because it's worth knowing. You would expect an athlete, right? You're to stack physical energy sources. They're going to always get enough sleep. They're always going to get proper hydration and nutrition. When you talk about nutrition, they're going to get fats and carbs and protein, right? They're going to stack available fuel sources because they need all the available fuel sources the body can produce to compete, to do what they do. Same thing is true with psychological fuel sources, our intrinsic motivators. Peak performers want all their intrinsic motivators, curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, mastery, pointed in the same direction, aligned, stacked and aligned. If this is foundational to generating motivation, this is foundational to generating flow, this is foundational for long-term peak performance, it's kind of an onboarding protocol. And as you pointed out, what the research consistently shows is human beings are designed, I like to say human beings are designed to go big. What you could say more formally is human beings are designed for self-actualization, and or as Abraham Maslow so eloquently put it, whatever a person can be, they must be. And must be is the important criterion. Here's why. There are 8 major known causes of depression now and anxiety. Now, let's be clear. Depression and anxiety are we are in the largest mental health crisis the world has ever seen, right? That 1 out of 10 adults will seek treatment for aggression, anxiety, or depression over the course of this year. And once every 12 seconds, somebody kills themselves. So we're losing, right? It's epidemic proportions and we're losing. I mean, badly, right? If COVID was killing this many people, we'd have twice the response that we currently have, right? I mean, like it's a real pandemic, it's a mental health pandemic. And you look at the 8 major causes of depression, 2 of them get the most attention. 2 of them are what everybody talks about. The first is genetics, which is I have the wrong genes. I don't produce enough serotonin, norepinephrine, like insert neurochemical here because of my genetics. The second one is trauma. This really horrible thing happened to me and I cannot get past it. And yet, if you look at the actual data, the vast majority of the time, well, first of all, genetics, we know it's only 50% of the equation. In depression and anxiety, it is only ever 50% of the equation. There is nobody knows about a condition where you can't produce any of it and thus you cannot, right? It's always lifestyle choices or things that are happening plus anxiety and depression. And on the trauma side, if you look at the literature, we have rising PTSD for sure, but it's not an epidemic global proportions. The reason is most of the time traumatic stress leads to post-traumatic growth, not post-traumatic stress disorder, right? The vast majority of the time, it's this Ernest Hemingway, the world breaks everyone and afterwards many are stronger at the broken places. Emphasis on many, right? What are the other 6 causes of depression? The number 1 cause of depression, number 1 and 2, lack of meaningful work and lack of meaningful values. What is lack of meaningful work in the real world? It's work that I'm not curious about, I'm not passionate about, it's not aligned with my values and my purpose, that I don't have autonomy to pursue in the way I want to pursue, that does not afford me the opportunity to develop my skills and pursue mastery, and doesn't produce flow. That's what we mean by lack of meaningful work. Lack of meaningful values is very similar. It's lack of purpose, right? Lack of work that aligns with my purpose, my personality, and doesn't produce flow. That's like on the ground. Not going big is bad for us. Literally foundationally bad for us. We are designed to to rise to our full capability. And when you don't rise to your full capability, there are significant consequences. In a sense, if you don't use the system the way it's been designed to use, you want to use your vacuum cleaner as a hammer, it's going to break. It appears that we are all designed to go big. Flow is ubiquitous. It's optimal performance, right? It's a stage. It's available to everybody, regardless of class, creed, culture, right? Or task, and independent of task, right? So like it's everywhere. We all can get into flow. The data is overwhelmingly clear on this. And it seems to not, if we don't regularly get into flow and use it to extend our performance, which is sort of how this work gets done, there are significant consequences. There are significant mental health consequences. And this, by the way, if you go back to the ancient Greeks and said, hey guys, turns out peak mental performance is also tied to peak physical performance, and is also tied to, like, if you don't do these things, you're going to be a miserable SOB. The Greeks would go, oh yeah, dude, of course. That's why we've got all these academies where we train both at once. Like, of course, this is not new information.
What did I tell you about my dissertation? Eudaimonia. That's an Aristotelian term.
Aristotelian term, right. Like, this is not, and there's a great book on eudaimonia by a philosopher at Duke, Owen Flanagan, called The Really Hard Problem. Not the hard problem, but the really hard problem. And it's essentially about eudaimonia and flow and the Greeks all the way forward. Now flow is we know it's all coded together, even on the positive psychology side, right? There are 3 tiers of happiness, and the top 2 have flow in the definition.
Right.
So, like, we know this is all related, and it's all related because it's biologically linked. And if it's biologically linked, it was designed to work a certain way. And, if I try to pour gasoline in my stomach, it doesn't run the human car very well. But if I try to put a ham sandwich in my car, it doesn't run the car very well. Should I be surprised?
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned, and it's worth just quickly mentioning, some of that research you're talking about, lost connections, right? By, what is it, Johann Hari? I might not be pronouncing that correctly.
Hariri, and by the way, it's any of these guests.
Okay. Anyway, great. So you don't know either.
Great book, Johann.
Yeah. Either way, the book is Lost Connections. It's worth checking out. And what did you mention? Lack of relevancy, lack of meaningful work, lack of meaningful values.
Yeah, one is lack of exposure to nature. And that may ultimately come down to lack of exposure to primary flow triggers like novelty, complexity, unpredictability, risk. It may also come down to the other side of that coin is that we know that a 20-minute walk in the woods outperforms most SSRIs in the market, right? So we evolved in this. That one is a little tilted off the like system is designed to go big and more like the system is designed. You're built to have regular encounters with flows triggers. And if you don't, there seems to be a cost for that, though that is a super edgy, unexplored. That's the edge of the research. I'm pushing to say those things out loud.
So lack of meaningful work, lack of meaningful values, lack of relevancy. You're saying all these things.
Do you want me to get up? I have to pull up the full list if you want.
Well, no. Because what I want to point out, like obviously there's going to be multiple different causes of lots of different things, especially on the mental health side, right? But one of those 3 things that you just mentioned, relevancy, meaning, values, things of that nature, you're laying out that list. And what I'm thinking is, man, that does not sound like the typical experience in a high school classroom.
Well, let's talk about 2 other things before we dive into that, because I want to back up a little bit further because yes, everything you're talking about, but there's a couple foundational things that are really worth talking about also. Curiosity. I want to go deeper into curiosity.
Please, I'd love for you to do that. Yeah.
Because this is really do I think schools should be responsible for passion? No, but we could certainly teach our kids how to cultivate it. Do I think schools are responsible for purpose? No, but we should give children the opportunity to find their purpose within an educational framework that could serve other goals as well. I think that's true. But where are schools absolutely responsible? Curiosity and mastery. Those are responsibilities. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about school. And schools are crushing curiosity, as you know, but we can talk about why. But here's what's so dangerous about this, and I don't think most people know this. We don't live in reality, right? From a neurobiological perspective, we live in all the information that comes into the brain is screened because it's too much information. The brain can't handle it all at once. And so what gets through? The vast majority of what gets through are our fears, stuff that we're scared of that we have to avoid, or our goals, right? Fears and goals. And what that looks like neurobiologically is anxiety and curiosity, or anxiety and excitement, are opposite sides of the same coin. They're the same neurochemicals, the same physiological, neurobiological signal. The frame is different. So you're either scared to shit or you're goal-oriented, right?
Just real quickly, so you mentioned frame. You're talking about a cognitive frame and the way we think about things. Earlier mentioned Dr. Chris Bertram, and he explained this to a lot of the FRC coaches the other day, right? You're going to see these things show up as the same, basically, neurochemical signature, put a brain in an fMRI.
Yeah, let me give you an extreme example. Let me tell you where it comes from. Temple Grandin, who is a behavioral pathologist, and is probably the world's leading expert on the animal behavior. And she does a lot of she teaches slaughterhouses how to be humane, basically. That's what the work she does. How do you do very animal friendly meat production, that sort of stuff. And so her work, she was the first person to discover that most mammals literally can't feel anxiety and excitement, or anxiety and curiosity at the same time. When they are doing inoculation for cows, right? They have to put them into pans and bring them into it's terrifying. Stress hurts the cow. If they're dairy cows, you've just screwed up your milk. If they're meat cows, you've actually just altered the taste of the beef, right? You have to keep animals happy and calm. How do they do it? They put stuff around the cows that they're curious about. So as they're moving into the barn, right, there are certain colors that cows found innately curious and certain shapes that they are blocking anxiety with curiosity. Humans are a little different. We can feel both at once, but it's very difficult. My point is that if education is not cultivating curiosity, you are by default cultivating anxiety because that's how the system works. And so one of the things that I think about when we talk about education being broken, one of the things I want to start, where do you start? I always think you've got to start with curiosity because the opposite is anxiety. And we know anxiety blocks learning, right? Anxiety blocks learning. So you can't have the discussion until you get to so anyways, that was my little tidbit on that.
That's exactly where I wanted you to go, because you also mentioned this intrinsic stack, right? These 5 intrinsic motivators. I am curious about that because you've often argued in the book and in some of our trainings that it really has to happen in a particular order.
It doesn't have to happen in that order, but it does appear that you get the best results. And this is, so if you want to take a look at the neurobiology of this, a lot of the foundational work on motivation, as you know, was done by Edward Deci and Rob Ryan.
Deci and Ryan, yeah.
So Ryan went on and wrote a phenomenal paper that came out, I want to say 2019, on the neurobiology of intrinsic motivation. He teamed up with another neuroscientist, and it's one of my favorite papers ever. And it's very it's a lot of because they did all the work on a number of the foundational motivators that I'm talking about, and he went back and did the neurobiology, and it's a really good sort of lit review, new research. Just it's fantastic paper, worth checking out. But what that research plus stuff we've been looking at for a long time says, yeah, man, you do it in this sequence, it tends to work better. And can you do it in other, ways? Of course you can. I mean, one of the, Art Impossible is a book about how to do this and what's the order, what's the sequence. And, the 2 things that are worth pointing out about the book is that when peak performers read the book, most of their reaction is, oh, I'm doing this. Oh, I didn't know about this, but I see why I should be doing this. Oh, crap, I didn't even know this step existed. It was linked that way, but I see it now because I see that deficit. And right, peak performers if you're top 30% or above in whatever you do, probably at least 50% of the stuff that's in that book is already in your toolkit. Why? Because it's a limited biology. Right? There's only certain things you can do. And so you can do these independent. It's just that when you do them in this order, if you think about from an evolutionary perspective, it starts to make sense that curiosity builds into passion and passion builds into purpose, and so forth. Now, where autonomy and mastery come in is the open question, because mastery is going to start coming online very early in the process. And autonomy may be there or it may not be there. But what it does see is if you want to see the system break down and you start getting anxiety and depression, have a purpose, give somebody a purpose, and don't give them the autonomy to pursue that purpose, all hell breaks loose. There's growing research in not just the mental health community, but in the autoimmune community, in autoimmune conditions, is that when people have so-called spontaneous recoveries from autoimmune conditions, flow is always involved in the recovery, but so is getting on purpose, aligning with values, passion, and purpose. And it's I've gone deep into that literature. I've never worked on it. I've never seen anybody write about it, but it's shockingly clear in the evidence that when you read cases of people who sort of bounce back after these horrific autoimmune conditions, there's always the illness took all this stuff away from me, so I decided whatever time I have left, I'm going to live totally on purpose and on message. That's a common sort of gauntlet that people go through when they get sick, but often it results in so-called spontaneous healing, which is not, the mechanism seems to be flow, and there's a lot of neurophysiological evidence pointed to this, and it's been, I mean, Herb Benson did the foundational work on this years ago at Harvard, but it's been building, and there's more and more research to this point. So it may also be, bad for your immune system to not be on purpose as well, too.
What you're talking about a little bit, I mean, there's different terms for it, the well-being boost, the happiness advantage, but like when we're in homeostasis, when things are aligned, when our biology is synced up, it leads to all sorts of advantages, right? Not just performative, but in terms of our resilience, our mental health, our creativity, our sleep quality, our immune system, all those sorts of things. And so that also kind of makes me think, like, part of what you're describing, what needs to be in place, and oftentimes what may not be in place in classrooms. And I've got two topics here. One is autonomy, but we'll come back to that. The other is, it seems to me that what a lot of young people are dealing with is a lot of the stress, a lot of the anxiety, and not necessarily a lot of the payoff. And by payoff, intrinsic activities, right? Or intrinsically rewarding activities, those are the payoff.
Yeah, I mean,
right? They are autotelic, right?
I think there's three things that are worth addressing in this. One are just a couple of facts about flow in education that we know. The first is there's really interesting work that shows that when teachers are in flow, oftentimes students are not. And the reason is the challenge skills balance, which is one of flow's most important triggers. The idea here is that flow follows focus, and we pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of that task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch but not snap. You're pushing on your skills. When a teacher is pushing on their skills, they're at the cutting edge of whatever's going on, right? They're talking about cool stuff they're into. They're not, the classroom is like, what? Dude, I don't know, huh? Right?
Yeah.
And when students are in flow, oftentimes teachers are not. So there's a phenomenological experience, which is, oh, I'm killing it, right? That is possibly mismatched to the student's experience. So that is one thing to be aware of. Second thing is, this is just startlingly important, and I wish we would we should learn this lesson in the damn classroom. So there's really great study by me, Csikszentmihalyi, and a bunch of other people. One of the larger studies I've seen on flow in education was on incoming high school freshmen secondary activities. School's their primary, what's their major secondary to? Football, band, I'm studying, art, take your pick.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Incoming freshmen, what's the clearest indicator that they're still going to be doing it as a senior? Right? 4 years worth of grit. I'm sticking to this thing. And great. By the time I'm a senior, it shows up on my resume and I can brag about it again.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Right? Matters to parents, matters to students, blah, blah, blah. How much flow the activity produces is the major indicator. How much flow their secondary activity produces as incoming freshmen is the greatest indicator that they will still be doing the activity as exiting seniors. In other words, flow is the best marker we have for grit.
Yep.
My argument is, if we know that, then this is the greatest argument for high flow classrooms ever. If the goal is going to be, how do you turn a student into a lifelong learner, which I think the goal of education has to be. And if that's the goal, well, the answer is flowy classrooms. They're it's right there. We know that. Okay. So those things out of the way. When it comes to the other thing that we know is, when you say flowy classroom, what the hell does that mean? Well, without having to reinvent the wheel, Montessori education works incredibly well. We know from work Csikszentmihalyi did and Kevin Rothunde did, that Montessori is a super high flow environment. Why is that? Well, because it's education that's built around three really important flow triggers, and probably many more. But one, uninterrupted periods of concentration that are 90 to 120 minutes long, which match our circadian focus cycles, right? We know we're built to focus. So, okay, good. It's self-directed learning, right? Meaning it's learning that aligns with values, strengths.
By the way, this is like the Finnish system as well, which is consistently ranked among the top education systems in the world globally. Right?
Yeah, I mean, this, it's not, I mean, they're not, and I mean, right. And so self-directed learning with 90, built around our foundation, and it's learning that emphasizes learning through doing, right? Don't just read about the windmill, go out and build one. And that engages multiple senses, which tends to drive flow. And since flow massively increases educational outcomes, right? We learn faster in flow, 240%, depending on the skills. But in some studies, in certain skills, it can be 240 to 500% faster than above baseline. So that's a big boost if we get it right. And so, there's a lot of advantages here, and it's not like none of it is super rocket science when it comes to flow in a classroom. Now, what does that actually, what I mean? What does that actually mean on the ground? That's a totally different thing. And I think the real problem is people cannot resist building grab bag schools, meaning, oh, flow is cool, but so is Stuart Brown's play stuff. And wow, Jay McDonagall's doing some cool shit. And I'm going to blend them all together and we're going to call it blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of that. And all that gives us is an opportunity to do a case study on blah, blah, blah. Is blah, blah, blah effective, right? Like this particular mismatch designed by this particular person. But like what I'm trying to do with flow is just say, hey, look, let's just take it back to these are the foundational neurobiological mechanisms. And let's just start to train with this stuff. And also, by the way, like, let's be open and honest about like blah, 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 right? Meaning we're going to mix and match 6 or 7 things. Certainly going to work for certain personalities. That blah, blah, blah is perfectly designed to fit, but it's clearly not going to work for everybody because that's what the flow literature says too. Right? Like you don't have one-stop shopping meets everybody if you just don't. You just got to kind of go back to like this is foundational evolutionary neuropsychology in a sense. Like we don't have a term for really what that level. But
what do you always say about biology and personality? Right?
Personality doesn't scale. Biology scales.
Right. Right. And what do we have in classrooms? We have a whole lot of different personalities.
You have a lot of cults of personalities, and you have foundational principles that are complicated by a lot of different. I mean, education serves a lot of masters, and most of them are very. You know what I mean? Like not in a bad way. Like serves a lot of masters, but we need it to do these things, and that's great. And I don't think the thing of it is, and it's worth just telling the truth about this out loud. We know, and by we, I mean the world, and I also mean we, the Flow Research Collective, because we're doing this work. The classroom of the future is going to be fully distributed VR classrooms because you don't have to build schools. They are going to be very, very immersive, and they're going to be built around flow triggers because VR is very good at getting it flow. And you can also put an AI layer under VR and make it individual customized learning. We know this is coming. Now, are schools going to be involved? Are teachers going to be, is there going to be remnants of the old system? I mean, I hope so, because I think the research shows that, if you have that kind of learning platform and then have like teacher as coach rather than sage on stage, that's super dynamic and that's really good. And if you can actually get kids together in learning pods and give them a coach and build those learning pods around group flow, psychological safety principles, boom, now you're really cooking with fire and you're going someplace, and that has yet to be invented. And it's not going to be one-stop shopping. It's not going to be one size fits every kid. But hopefully, as you put it, there will be some heuristics that work.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, and I love that you say that still includes the teacher, right? Because we know from a variety of different studies, the teacher-student relationship is one of the most significant predictors of performance and achievement, well, all sorts of things, right? I think the question is like, what's that relationship like? You mentioned coaching as opposed to sage on the stage all the time and things of that nature.
I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I have studied expert performance at the elite level as much as anybody else alive. There may be people who, you know what I mean, but any list of like the people who have looked at this the hardest and met the most people who accomplished amazing things is got to include me. And a couple things are very, very true across the board. But one of them is, if you're at the top one way or another, it's because you probably had a handful of adults who were phenomenal mentors for you as a kid. You see success come out of all kinds of broken educational systems. You do. You don't often see success come out of places where there is nobody to point you in the right direction, right? To help you steer, or to help you solve the intractable problems that were actually in front of you, right? That teacher may not have ever helped you solve schoolwork, but they may have helped they may have helped you solve life, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
and sometimes that's the bigger thing, which is interesting. Now, as I've long said, the work we're doing, we're building high flow VR based learning environments for worker retraining. For example, by the end of the decade, the largest employer in America is going to be is truckers, and we have autonomous trucks, and they're being built, and Elon Musk is building them. So if that tells you what the future of the trucking industry is, right? It's gone, and it's the largest employer in America, and so we're going to have to reskill all those people in the 2030s. And flow and VR, this is a good tool for that. That said, the platform that's going to emerge out of it, and we're not the only people working on these kinds of ideas. A bunch of people are working on these kinds of ideas. The platform that emerges out of it can be used for education. The reason I'm not going near education, and the reason I'm psyched that people like you are poking around this stuff, is I don't want to end up in a curriculum battle with parents. Because the curriculum, what matters are the heuristics, right? The curriculum, this should be curriculum agnostic, as long as the curriculum matches a student's intrinsic motivators and delivers the educational outcomes we are hoping for. I just don't want to be involved in the what are those educational outcomes argument, because I think it's going to be too loud, too shrill, and not like, I don't have expertise. I don't want to have expertise. And I will say one other thing. I have said for a while that if you're going to do flow interventions with minors, you should be training the parents alongside the kids, because, among other things, we know risk is a great flow trigger. We know that risk and learning how to confront risk and learning how to confront fear is one of the single best skills we can teach anybody. And we know that if you fail a bunch along the way, and we can teach you resilience, right, even better. Now we've given you core life skills, and your chances of getting to success, and whatever metric you want for success, are so much great, right? Like, boom. And I don't want to have to make risk decisions for children, for minors, right? Like I have said for a while, if we're going to train kids, can we start by doing a Flow for Mothers program, because they are often in charge of their children's risk. Like they set the risk bar for their kids often in the household. And I'm like, let's just start by talking to moms and arming them.
Here's something I want to ask you about. We'll see where it takes us. But one of the things we were talking about with the order of the intrinsic stack, and it can happen in other ways, there's a really interesting conversation to have around autonomy and choice. And in particular, because as you said, education serves many masters, and one of the masters that it sort of serves, it seems, is filling jobs and fueling an economy, right? And GDP and, globalized economy and all those sorts of things. And I think there's a conversation to be had around like kind of what's an appropriate level of choice for young people to have, and also understanding that, it's fueling a system that's supposed to, in theory, serve the greater good. And I've been in different conversations and arguments with people at times, especially educators, who see those things as sort of at odds with each other and in tension with each other, right? No, they need to learn these skills to go out and be productive citizens, sort of argument, right?
Yeah,
I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Here's the problem with the productive citizen argument. And this is something I talk about a lot in Flow for Writers. But I also talk about a little bit in in Art of Impossible, the new book. For example, if you listen to the vast majority of the productive member of society argument, right? What they're basically saying is that schools should be a worker training program for whatever job you want, but that's the job of school. It should be like wherever job you want, we should train you. And when I'm training people for flow, I always tell them to read novels far outside your perspective. And the reason is, novels are novel. They force your brain to adopt somebody else's perspective for a period of time, right? They shatter your ego, they make you somebody else, and they make you live in that world for a little bit. And this builds empathy, and it builds cultural acceptance and perspective and wisdom and pattern recognition and a whole bunch of blah, 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 blah. And nobody in the worker training program is going to say, okay, and here is this vast literature that we now call comparative literature, for lack of a right or anything else. You should also learn, right? Like the problem is not that the worker training idea serves society great is a bad idea. It's that the people who are leading that argument, right? Because a lot of it I hear coming out of Silicon Valley. I mean, it's people I know, and like it's Silicon Valley, it's very libertarian. It's very like, if you want to start a company at 14, we should be teaching you how. And I agree with that. But you also need to like learn how to think, and learning how to think requires doing things that make you uncomfortable, right? Training grit, which you're going to need, and resilience, like these. And I tell people for high flow lifestyles, read outside you're curious about, but very outside your core discipline, because if you only read inside your core discipline, you're not going to have the raw materials that we need for creative insight and flow at a certain level. And these are all performance difficulties.
Yeah. I want to point out, because we've obviously been digging into flow, and flow makes us better and it feels great and all those sorts of things. But you've mentioned it once or twice, and I just finished a little mini learning series on this. Grit, resilience, being able to endure some unpleasantness, which I think is one of the ways, traditional positive psychology has not necessarily marketed itself that well. The idea that things need to always be about passion, always be pleasant.
Well,
always,
yeah. So, but remember, there's a sequence, right? We get the intrinsic motivators online first, then then goal setting, and then grit. And the truth of the matter is, the vast majority of time, this showed up in our data very clean. This is one of the reasons I wrote Art of Impossible. It's one of the reasons I built the Flow Research Collective. It is easy to train flow. It's the triggers work, right? It's just biology. It is hard to sustain a high flow lifestyle over time because of grit. You can't start really training grit until you're getting more flow in the equation, because it's too miserable to do. Doesn't feel good. It feels bad for everybody, right? There are multiple tiers of grit, and especially in the beginning, you got to train this tier, and then like, oh shit, I'm not done. I got next tier, and then I got to deal with this, and then I got to deal with this, and then I got to deal with this. And then, by the way, you have to maintain this stuff for the rest of your life, and you can never really stop training grit. You just stop minding the fact that you're training grit, and you just start to call it life. You know what I mean? Things like that. But
cold showers don't feel so cold anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. My point on that one is where people tend to wobble in high flow lifestyles and passion driven lifestyles is like living with passion, curiosity, passion, purpose, aligned with values and strengths, and getting lots of flow. Like, you absolutely have to do all those things. And as a result, you will go farther, faster over time. But the grit is like what you need when all that stuff goes away. And in any, right, and it will go away for months at a time. It will sometimes go away for years at a time. There are going to be long, hard, unpleasant stretches. We can identify the causes. You know what I mean? We can start to eliminate some of them, and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't change the fact that, and frustration is built into peak performance. You have to be frustrated to drop into flow. In fact, the work we're currently doing right now on the neural dynamics of flow state onset, what goes on in the brain in the first 2 seconds of flow, is more and more saying that you need to activate the fight response to get into flow. Literally. Only for a second, but and we know, by the way, when you activate the fight response, it correlates to the feeling that we call courage, but the actual internal phenomenology of activating the fight response and the portion of the thalamus that does it, it feels bad. The internal feeling is frustration and right? That's what it feels like, and it feels like that for everybody. Like, this is built in. So if you just think passion and purpose means easy, it's going to get easier. What I always tell people is, when you get it all right, It's not that your life gets more, you don't get more happiness. You probably actually get it, but on a moment to moment basis, you probably get a little less, because in peak performance, you're always performing at the edge of your skill set. So you're always uncomfortable. So on a moment by moment basis, you're probably uncomfortable more rather than less, right? Because you're not opting for easy, relaxing flow. You're always opting for more. The flip side is where you go off the charts is life satisfaction, overall well-being, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the markers you really care about that really, really, really matter. And that, my buddy Michael says, like, if it's not impacting, health and longevity over time, it's a bullshit marker. Right? Those are the only ones that, like, quality of life, health, longevity, like, you got to forget everything else, right? You got to look at the foundational metrics. Like, what are the basic numbers that you can report on? And, which is not to say income isn't a good metric, because certainly, lots of great things rise in lockstep with income, but, what does not rise in lockstep with income is happiness, well-being, and overall life satisfaction. So.
Yep. Well said. It's a great place to end. Steven Kotler, your new book is The Art of Impossible. As we talked about earlier, it has swept the bestseller charts. New York Times, LA Times,
I don't think you
USA
said that.
Today, all of those.
Yeah, Nick, you definitely didn't say that enough during the podcast. Maybe you could say that again.
I will say it at least 3 more times when we promo this episode. But it is, it's flying off of both the physical and digital shelves. It's terrific. I've between just reading it out of interest and running some book clubs around it, I've read it twice at this point. It's phenomenal, and we highly recommend everybody pick it up. Tell us where we can find you, social media, the FRC website, that sort of stuff.
You can find me at stevenkotler.com. You can find the Flow Research Collective at flowresearchcollective.com. If you're interested in our trainings, which Nick is involved in, zerotodangerous.com is the application page. You can sign up for a free consult with a peak performance. It's basically a conversation about peak performance and where you're at. Maybe Flow Zero to Dangerous is right for you. Maybe it's not. We'll figure that out along the way. But nobody's going to try to hard sell you anything. They're just going to talk to you about where you're at and if this might work for you. And that's free and that's available to anybody. And did we happen to mention Amazon and Art of Impossible? It swept the list. Did we say those things?
Listen, Steven, we really appreciate the time. I know how busy you are, and this was phenomenal. It's a great conversation. I know people are really going to enjoy it, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do.
Appreciate it, Steven. Talk soon. Our show is produced by the Shipley School, an independent pre-K through grade 12 day school, rethinking education and daring to hope that we can, in fact, build a better future. Come on and join us.